The 1950s weren't just about perfect lawns and white picket fences. They were also about declaring war on weeds that had actually been feeding and healing American families for centuries. 20 plants that your great-grandmother considered essential medicine and food were suddenly reclassified as enemies that needed to be eliminated from every yard in America. The reasons why will make you question everything you thought you knew about weeds. Number 20. Wild roses, rose hips. Your great-grandmother probably had wild rose bushes growing along her fence line, and every fall she'd gather the bright red rose hips to make jelly and tea that prevented scurvy through the winter months. These vitamin C-packed fruits contained more nutrition than oranges. But the 1950s suburban revolution declared wild roses unsightly weeds that made properties look unkempt. Homeowner associations actually passed rules requiring the removal of wild roses because their thorny canes were considered dangerous for children. What broke families' hearts was watching city crews arrive with chainsaws to remove rose bushes that had been providing free medicine for generations. The same hips that had sustained families through harsh winters were now seen as liability risks that could result in lawsuits if children got scratched. Insurance companies even refused to cover properties with dangerous wild roses, forcing families to eliminate bushes that had been family landmarks for decades. Number 19. Wild blackberry canes. The blackberry patches that had provided free fruit for generations of children suddenly became public enemy number one when the 1950s suburban development boom eliminated their natural habitat. These thorny canes had grown along every fence line and woodland edge, producing sweet berries that families gathered by the bucketful for pies, jams, and fresh eating. But developers complained that blackberry thickets were unsightly and interfered with clean property lines. City ordinances began requiring property owners to eliminate blackberry canes, claiming they were fire hazards and attracted rodents. The same patches where children had spent summer afternoons picking berries were bulldozed and replaced with sterile lawns that produced nothing edible. Families who protested were told that wild blackberries were primitive and that modern grocery stores made foraging unnecessary and dangerous. Number 18. Wild strawberry patches. The tiny wild strawberries that grew in meadows and woodland clearings were far more flavorful than their cultivated cousins. But the 1950s suburban development eliminated most of their natural habitat. Children had spent generations hunting for these thumbnail-sized berries that packed incredible flavor into every bite. But developers bulldozed the meadows and forest edges where they grew naturally. What made this particularly heartbreaking was that wild strawberries were often the first plants that children learned to identify and gather safely. The knowledge of where to find them and when they were ripe was passed down from grandparents to grandchildren, creating family traditions that connected multiple generations. When the habitat disappeared under suburban lawns and shopping centers, families lost not just free fruit, but irreplaceable bonding experiences. Number 17. Wild mint varieties. The wild mint that grew along streams and in moist corners had provided natural flavoring and digestive medicine for centuries, but the 1950s chemical lawn treatments made it impossible for these plants to survive in suburban environments. Unlike the controlled mint and herb gardens, wild mint varieties had intense flavors and medicinal properties that were far superior to anything you could buy in stores. Families who had traditional mint gathering spots found them poisoned by herbicides or eliminated by drainage projects that were supposed to prevent mosquito breeding. The same plants that had provided natural remedies for stomach problems and fresh flavoring for teas were now seen as weedy vegetation that needed to be controlled. Children lost their natural source of breath fresheners and upset stomach remedies that had grown free in every damp corner. Number 16. Wild asparagus. Wild asparagus was the spring delicacy that grew along fence lines and in ditches, producing spears that were more flavorful and nutritious than anything cultivated varieties could offer. Families who knew where to look could harvest pounds of free asparagus every spring, but the 1950s roadside herbicide campaigns eliminated most of the patches where it grew naturally. Highway departments began spraying herbicides along roadsides to create clean edges, destroying the wild asparagus patches that families had been harvesting for generations. The spears that had provided essential spring nutrition and marked the end of winter food shortages were poisoned in the name of modern road maintenance. Families lost their traditional asparagus gathering spots and the knowledge of where these valuable plants grew wild. Number 15. Elderflowers. The creamy white elderflower clusters that bloomed every spring had been gathered by families who knew they made the most delicate fritters and fragrant wines. But the 1950s brought new safety concerns about eating any wildflowers. These aromatic blossoms were completely safe and had been used in European and American cooking for centuries, but health authorities began warning against eating any flowers that weren't specifically grown for food. The same flowers that had provided delicate flavoring and natural yeast for winemaking were now considered potentially dangerous because people might confuse them with poisonous plants. Rather than teach proper identification, authorities decided it was safer to discourage all wildflower consumption. The knowledge of how to prepare elderflower fritters and wine was lost along with the tradition of gathering these fragrant spring blossoms. Number 14. Wild mushrooms. The wild mushrooms that experienced foragers had been gathering safely for generations suddenly became too dangerous to recommend when the 1950s brought several highly publicized cases of mushroom poisoning. Families who had traditional mushroom hunting spots and generations of knowledge about safe identification were told that all wild mushrooms were potentially deadly and should never be consumed. What made this particularly tragic was that experienced mushroom hunters had safety records that were better than many other food-gathering activities. But a few cases of inexperienced people eating dangerous varieties led to blanket warnings against all wild mushroom consumption. The free protein and unique flavors that had sustained families through lean times were now considered too risky, and traditional knowledge that had been passed down for centuries was dismissed as too dangerous for modern society. Number 13. Wild black walnuts. The black walnut trees that had provided free nuts and valuable timber for generations suddenly became nuisance trees that homeowners were encouraged to remove because they inhibited grass growth and stained sidewalks. These native trees produced nuts with intense flavor that was far superior to English walnuts, but their natural chemicals prevented grass from growing underneath them, making them incompatible with suburban lawn culture. Tree removal companies actually advertised services specifically for eliminating black walnut trees, claiming they were problem trees that lowered property values. The same trees that had provided free nuts, valuable timber, and natural pest control were now seen as obstacles to perfect lawns. Families who had traditional nut-gathering rituals watched as their walnut trees were cut down and replaced with ornamental trees that produced nothing edible. Number 12. Wild hickory nuts. Wild hickory trees were eliminated from suburban areas during the 1950s because their nuts were considered messy and attracted squirrels that homeowners didn't want in their perfectly manicured yards. These native trees produced incredibly flavorful nuts that were prized by families who knew how to crack them and extract the sweet meat inside, but suburban aesthetics had no tolerance for trees that dropped anything on lawns. The same nuts that had provided essential fats and proteins during winter months were now seen as maintenance problems that required cleanup and attracted pest animals. Tree removal services promoted the elimination of hickory trees in favor of ornamental varieties that looked neat but produced nothing useful. The traditional knowledge of how to process hickory nuts and the family gatherings centered around nut cracking were lost along with the trees. Number 11. Wild grapevines, fox grapes. The wild fox grapes that grew along fence lines and up trees produced small, intensely flavored grapes that made superior jelly and wine, but the 1950s suburban revolution declared them aggressive weeds that needed to be controlled. These native vines had provided free fruit for generations, but their tendency to climb and spread made them unwelcome in neighborhoods where every plant was expected to stay in its designated space. Chemical companies marketed herbicides specifically designed to eliminate wild grapevines, showing before and after photos of clean fence lines versus weedy ones covered with productive vines. The grapes that had made the best wild grape jelly and provided natural yeast for winemaking were poisoned in the name of tidy landscaping. Children lost their natural jungle gyms, and families lost a reliable source of free fruit that had superior flavor to anything available in stores. Number 10. Wild apple trees, feral. The wild apple trees that had grown from seeds scattered by birds or thrown away cores produced small, tart apples that were perfect for cooking and cider making, but the 1950s agricultural authorities declared them genetic contaminants that could spread diseases to commercial orchards. These feral trees were often hardier and more disease-resistant than cultivated varieties, but they were seen as threats to agricultural purity. Agricultural Extension Services launched campaigns to eliminate wild apple trees, claiming they harbored pests and diseases that could damage commercial crops. The same trees that had provided free fruit and required no care were now considered dangerous to the agricultural economy. Families who had traditional wild apple gathering spots watched as the trees were cut down and burned, eliminating both free food and the genetic diversity that made these trees so hardy. Number 9. Wild cherry trees. Wild cherry trees were eliminated from suburban areas during the 1950s when their small, tart cherries were deemed inedible compared to large, sweet commercial varieties. These native trees produced cherries that were perfect for jams and pies, with an intense flavor that commercial cherries couldn't match, but they were now seen as junk trees that had no value in modern landscapes. The same cherries that had provided essential fruit for wildlife and families were now considered worthless because they were small and required processing to be palatable. Tree removal services promoted the elimination of wild cherry trees in favor of ornamental varieties that produced showy flowers but no fruit. The knowledge of how to process wild cherries into delicious preserves was lost along with the trees that had been providing free fruit for centuries. Number 8. Wild plum thickets. Wild plum thickets were eliminated during the 1950s suburban development because their thorny spreading habit was incompatible with lawn mowers and property maintenance equipment. These native shrubs produced small, tart plums that made exceptional jelly and preserves, but their tendency to form dense thickets made them unwelcome in neighborhoods that prized easy maintenance and clean lines. The same plums that had sustained families through harsh seasons were now seen as obstacles to modern landscaping that required mechanical maintenance. Bulldozers cleared wild plum thickets to make room for suburban development, and the remaining patches were eliminated by homeowners who wanted yards that could be easily mowed and maintained. The intense flavor and a natural pectin that made wild plum jelly superior to commercial varieties were lost to convenience and aesthetics. Number 7. Sumac berries. Sumac berries were the fuzzy red clusters that made a refreshing drink similar to lemonade, but the 1950s brought confusion between edible sumac and poisonous varieties that led to blanket warnings against all sumac consumption. The staghorn sumac that produced edible berries was completely different from poison sumac, but authorities decided it was safer to discourage all sumac use rather than teach proper identification. Families who had been making sumac aid for generations were told that all sumac was potentially dangerous and should be avoided. The same berries that had provided vitamin C and a refreshing summer drink were now considered too risky for public consumption. The traditional knowledge of how to identify safe sumac varieties and prepare the berries properly was dismissed as too dangerous for modern families who might make identification mistakes. Number 6. Wild ginger. Wild ginger was the aromatic root that grew in shaded woodlands and provided both flavoring and medicine for digestive problems. But the 1950s suburban development eliminated most of the forest understory where it thrived. This native plant was unrelated to tropical ginger, but had similar properties and had been used by indigenous peoples and early settlers for centuries. The same root that had provided natural remedies for nausea and stomach problems was lost when developers cleared woodlands for housing subdivisions. The few remaining patches were often destroyed by landscaping projects that preferred ornamental plants over wild medicinal herbs. Families lost access to a gentle, effective medicine that had grown free in every shaded woodland corner. Number 5. Wild parsley. Wild parsley was the aromatic herb that grew in disturbed soil and provided both flavoring and medicinal benefits. But the 1950s brought new safety concerns about plant identification because wild parsley could be confused with deadly poison hemlock by inexperienced foragers. Rather than teach proper identification techniques, authorities decided to eliminate wild parsley and warn against eating any wild plants that might be mistaken for something dangerous. The same herb that had provided essential vitamins and distinctive flavor was now considered too risky for public safety. Herbicide campaigns targeted wild parsley along with other weedy plants, and families lost access to a flavorful herb that was superior to cultivated varieties. The traditional knowledge of how to safely identify and use wild parsley was dismissed as too dangerous for modern society. Number 4. Wild chives. Wild chives were the slender, onion-flavored herbs that grew in meadows and provided delicate seasoning for families who knew where to find them. But the 1950s suburban development eliminated most of the grassland habitats where they thrived naturally. These native herbs had a milder, more complex flavor than cultivated chives and could be harvested sustainably without damaging the plants. The same herbs that had provided subtle onion flavoring and natural pest deterrent properties were lost when meadows were converted to suburban lawns and shopping centers. The few remaining patches were often eliminated by herbicide treatments designed to create uniform grass surfaces. Families lost access to a delicate seasoning that was superior to anything available in stores and the knowledge of where these valuable herbs grew wild. Number 3. Wild sage. Wild sage was the aromatic herb that grew in dry areas and provided both seasoning and medicinal smoke for respiratory problems. But the 1950s brought new restrictions on burning any plant materials due to fire safety concerns and air quality regulations. This native herb had been used by indigenous peoples and settlers for centuries, but modern authorities were uncomfortable with any practices that involved burning plants. The same herb that had provided natural remedies for coughs and colds was now considered too dangerous because of fire risks and potential respiratory irritation from smoke. The traditional knowledge of how to safely use wild sage for medicinal purposes was dismissed as primitive and potentially harmful. Families lost access to a powerful natural medicine that had been growing free in dry, sunny locations. Number 2. Wild thyme. Wild thyme was the low-growing aromatic herb that carpeted dry hillsides and provided both seasoning and natural antiseptic properties. But the 1950s suburban development eliminated most of the rocky, well-drained soils where it thrived naturally. This native herb had a more intense flavor than cultivated thyme and had been used medicinally for respiratory problems and wound care. The same herb that had provided essential oils for natural healing was lost when hillsides were graded for housing developments, and the remaining patches were eliminated by landscaping that preferred ornamental plants over wild herbs. Families lost access to a powerful antiseptic and flavoring agent that was superior to cultivated varieties and the knowledge of how to identify and use wild thyme properly. Number 1. Wild fennel. Wild fennel was the tall, feathery plant that provided both edible seeds and medicinal properties for digestive problems. But the 1950s agricultural authorities classified it as an invasive weed that competed with crops and needed to be eliminated from farming areas. This aromatic plant had been brought by European immigrants who valued its culinary and medicinal uses, but it was now seen as a threat to agricultural productivity. The same plant that had provided natural remedies for colic and digestive problems was now considered an enemy of modern farming that stole nutrients from cash crops. Herbicide campaigns specifically targeted wild fennel, and within a decade, most people had forgotten that this weed was actually a valuable herb with superior flavor and medicinal properties. The traditional knowledge of how to use wild fennel safely and effectively was lost along with the plants themselves, eliminating centuries of herbal wisdom in the name of agricultural efficiency. These 20 weeds tell the story of how America lost its connection to wild food and free medicine in the name of suburban perfection and chemical convenience. What our great-grandmothers knew as essential survival plants became enemies to be eliminated, taking centuries of traditional knowledge with them. Hit that subscribe button and check out our next video about the garden herbs that were banned in the 1960s. The war on useful plants was just getting started.